Today, Paris looks like a romantic postcard come to life. Millions of tourists flock here every year for the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, and the cozy cafes lining the narrow streets. However, behind this elegant facade of the world's capital of fashion and art lies a completely different story. For centuries, this city was torn apart by internal conflicts. The authorities here always viewed their own people with suspicion, as any spark of discontent could escalate into a destructive riot. Each historical era brought new upheavals to the banks of the Seine, which literally reshaped the capital's appearance. It is commonly believed that true greatness is born in conditions of stability, but the example of Paris proves the opposite. Its unique strength and capacity for development have always been rooted in its ability to overcome its own internal catastrophes. In this video, we will trace a journey spanning 2,000 years. We will examine the historical mechanism in which the ambitions of rulers, the despair of the poor, and the boldness of new philosophical ideas constantly clashed. And to understand how this rebellious character was formed, we need to go back to the very beginning. In the 3rd century BCE, the Celtic tribe of the Parisii founded a modest wooden settlement. They named it Lutetia, which literally meant marshy place. The choice of location was no accident. The Parisii occupied a small island that allowed them to control the most convenient crossing over the wide Seine River. Whoever held this waterway automatically gained control over lucrative trade routes and the movement of people.
The Romans quickly recognized the strategic value of this marshy island. Soon they captured the settlement and began rebuilding it according to their imperial standards.
Lutetia was transformed into a classic Roman city with perfectly straight streets. On the left bank, a massive stone amphitheater was built, capable of holding about 15,000 spectators. Luxurious thermal baths, forums, and paved roads appeared, securely connecting this river port to the rest of the empire. The remains of this ancient grandeur are still hidden deep beneath the foundations of modern Paris, but the ancient idol could not last forever. By the end of the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire began to rapidly decline. Barbarian tribes breached the northern borders, and Lutetia's security collapsed.
In a panic, the locals abandoned their beautiful stone neighborhoods along the banks and retreated back to the Ile de la Cite.
To survive, they dismantled the old Roman temples and used their stones to build a massive defensive wall. It was the logic of a fortress defense that defined the city's architecture for centuries to come. During this troubled time, the Parisians found a spiritual anchor. In the 5th century, when the city was threatened by an invasion of the ferocious Huns, a young Christian woman named Genevieve convinced the residents not to abandon their homes and to unite in prayer. Genevieve enjoyed immense authority among the townspeople, and when the Huns ultimately bypassed the city, she became the patron saint of Paris, establishing a powerful tradition of faith. Shortly after the fall of Rome, control of the region passed to the Franks. At the very beginning of the 6th century, King Clovis made Paris the capital of his kingdom. Clovis went down in history as the monarch who succeeded in uniting the scattered Frankish tribes under a single rule and who adopted Christianity. Under his successors, the city gradually evolved into an important administrative and religious center. New wooden bridges were built across the Seine. Markets stimulated trade, and the products of local artisans were sold far beyond the city walls. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, the Frankish state expanded its borders. Paris found itself at the crossroads of major European events and became a key stronghold in the north. Reliable bastions gradually took shape along the river. Cultural life flourished, and merchants and clergy flocked to the city.
But this relative calm turned out to be merely the lull before a new, even more terrifying storm.
In the 9th century, long ships with dragon-headed prows arrived from the northern seas. These were the Vikings, fierce Scandinavian seafarers and ruthless warriors who terrorized the coastal cities of Europe. In 845, they reached Paris. Seized by panic, the townspeople were unable to organize a resistance and simply bribed the invaders with a colossal sum of 7,000 pounds of silver. For the authorities, this was an indelible disgrace, though it did spare the city from total destruction. However, the Vikings quickly realized that this wealthy river hub was an excellent target for constant extortion. In 885, a massive Norman fleet once again approached the Ile de la Cité. This time, the enemy numbered several tens of thousands, while Paris had only about 200 defenders. A grueling medieval siege began, lasting several long months. The Parisians suffered from disease and severe hunger, but continued to desperately repel attacks with arrows, boiling oil, and stones. They showed incredible resilience and eventually received reinforcements from the monarch. This siege became a turning point in the mindset of the townspeople. The Parisians finally realized that their wealth would always attract invaders. The city began hastily turning its hard-won fear into stone. The fortress walls were reinforced, bridges were rebuilt, and a complex system of defensive structures was created. But while the residents were erecting towers against external enemies, a completely different force was emerging within the densely built-up island. Merchants were returning to the city, craft guilds were growing stronger, and the influence of the church was expanding. Great wealth, ambitious people, and religious authority converged in one place. Such a concentration inevitably turns a city into a melting pot where cutting-edge ideas begin to take shape.
The early stage of Paris history concluded with the creation of a solid foundation.
But a transformation lay ahead that would reshape the intellectual landscape of all of Western Europe. What would happen when a true university emerged behind these high walls? By the 12th century, Paris had begun to confidently expand beyond the narrow confines of its old defensive Ile de la Cité. This growth was inextricably linked to the Capetians, an ambitious dynasty of French kings who reigned from 987 to 1328, and laid the foundations for a strong, centralized state. They made the expanding city the true center of their political and economic power. To leave a lasting testament to the absolute power of the royal crown, the kings initiated the grand construction of one of the most famous buildings in world history. The famous Gothic Notre Dame Cathedral took nearly 200 long and arduous years to build, and this architectural masterpiece remains to this day the main symbol not only of Paris, but of all of France. While hundreds of stonemasons were erecting the skyward-reaching Gothic arches on the island, a true intellectual revolution was taking place on the left bank of the Seine. The University of Paris was officially founded here, later becoming world-renowned as the Sorbonne. Students from all over Europe flocked here by the thousands to study theology, philosophy, and law under the greatest minds of their time. This bustling district of the city is still called the Latin Quarter for a purely practical reason. Thousands of young people and professors communicated daily on these streets exclusively in Latin, which was the international language of medieval science. The university very quickly transformed the city into the intellectual capital of all of Western Europe. Within its walls, heated and sometimes dangerous debates raged about the nature of God, the rights of kings, and the structure of the entire physical universe.
The authorities soon realized that a concentration of thousands of educated and free-thinking young people could become incredibly explosive.
To avoid constant riots, the kings had to make serious concessions and grant the university special legal privileges, effectively creating an independent state within the capital.
As free-thinking ideas flourished, the royal authorities sought to tighten their physical grip on this restless metropolis.
King Philip II Augustus, an energetic monarch who actively reclaimed French lands from England and established a strict vertical chain of command, decided to surround the sprawling city of Paris with a new, powerful fortress wall. On the city's western border, he ordered the construction of a formidable defensive castle to guard against potential attacks from the river. Centuries later, this gloomy and impregnable medieval stronghold would become the Louvre, the most famous and opulent art museum on the planet. Thanks to rapid construction and trade, by the early 14th century, Paris had become one of the largest and wealthiest cities of its time. It was home to about 200,000 people, making it a veritable human anthill of the Middle Ages. The narrow wooden streets were packed with merchants, artisans, priests, and the poor, who flocked here from all over the vast country. But the city paid a terrible price for such monstrous population density. Dirt, a lack of basic sanitation, and unbearable overcrowding turned the capital into a perfect powder keg for large-scale epidemics. In 1348, this biological time bomb exploded. The Black Death, the dreaded bubonic plague, struck the thriving trading city, and medieval medicine had no cure for it. The epidemic spread with such incredible speed that the streets were literally filled with the bodies of the city's dead. Within a few years, this terrible disease had wiped out up to half of the capital's entire population. The city's economy completely collapsed. The once bustling markets instantly emptied, and the survivors were in a state of utter terror. After such a colossal demographic blow, it seemed that the city would never be able to recover. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that, against the backdrop of the epidemic, France was torn apart by the endless and exhausting 100 Years' War, with the English crown over the right to the French throne. Royal taxes soared to finance the army. People were desperately starving, and this tension inevitably erupted into violence. In 1358, the first major social uprising broke out in Paris. Enraged townspeople, led by Etienne Marcel, a wealthy and influential merchant prévôt, representing the city's commercial elite, seized the royal palace and brutally murdered the monarch's chief advisors. This was the first historical instance in which the streets of Paris directly imposed their bloody will upon the legitimate authorities. The political crisis continued to deepen, and in the early 15th century, Paris was shamefully surrendered to the English military occupiers.
Foreign soldiers patrolled the capital's streets, while the legitimate French king appeared weak and utterly insignificant.
Only Joan of Arc, a simple peasant girl who claimed divine guidance and managed to restore the French army's lost hope and fighting spirit, was able to turn the tide of history. And although Joan herself was never able to liberate Paris during her lifetime, her decisive actions set in motion an irreversible process leading to the final expulsion of the English. After the official end of the 100 Years' War, Paris was a pitiful sight of charred ruins and empty, abandoned houses. The French kings were so traumatized by the riots in the capital that they preferred to live in luxurious, secure castles in the Loire Valley, far away from this filthy and wayward place. But economic logic and the incredibly advantageous geographical position of the Seine once again prevailed over the monarch's political fears. Trade gradually revived, the guilds regained their former influence, and people slowly returned to the city. Paris proved once again that it is practically impossible to erase it from the historical map forever. The harsh Middle Ages gave the city not only great stone cathedrals and the oldest prestigious university, it embedded in Paris's genetic code a propensity for violent social upheavals and bloody street battles. The ideas born within the quiet walls of the Sorbonne began to inevitably blend with the open discontent of the city's starving artisans. This dangerous combination of secret knowledge and pent-up resentment was just waiting for the right spark. A recovering Paris was entering the Renaissance, an era that would bring the city not only incredible visual beauty, but also new rivers of fresh blood. In the 16th century, the Renaissance burst into France from distant, sunny Italy, radically transforming the cultural and architectural landscape of the capital. This process was spearheaded by King Francis I, an ambitious and enlightened monarch who went down in history for his large-scale wars with Emperor Charles V and his patronage of the arts. On a grand scale, he invited the finest European artists to his court, including the great Leonardo da Vinci. It was on Francis I's orders that the main, gloomy tower of the Louvre was demolished to let sunlight into the halls. The old medieval fortress began to be actively rebuilt into a luxurious, spacious palace with huge windows and elegant facades. The city was indeed becoming more architecturally beautiful with each passing day. But behind this glamorous facade, social tensions were reaching a critical point. Alongside the new art, the bold ideas of the Reformation rapidly spread throughout Paris. Thanks to the invention of the printing press, banned Protestant texts were distributed in print runs of thousands, ruthlessly splitting society in two. Yesterday's good neighbors split into two irreconcilable camps. Catholics and Protestant Huguenots began a fierce struggle for spiritual influence and real political power in the state. The narrow streets of what was once a unified metropolis instantly turned into a zone of constant armed skirmishes, treacherous provocations, and brutal political assassinations. This religious hatred reached its peak during the hot summer of 1572, when one of the most horrific nights in European history unfolded in Paris. On August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, heavy church bells tolled, signaling to radical Catholics to begin a mass slaughter. Enraged mobs began methodically and brutally murdering their Protestant neighbors right in their own homes. Blood flowed in veritable streams across the cobblestones, and the mutilated bodies of the slain were thrown by the hundreds directly into the waters of the Seine. In just a few nightmarish days, more than 30,000 people were slaughtered with impunity in Paris and its environs. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre became an indelible stain on the city's reputation, vividly demonstrating to the world the destructive and blind power of the Parisian mob. The royal authority, which had initially calculatedly provoked this nightmare to eliminate political rivals, surprisingly quickly lost control over the blood-crazed townspeople. Religious fratricidal wars raged for decades, completely devastating the economy and bleeding all of France dry. Only Henry IV, the legitimate, courageous, and incredibly pragmatic heir to the throne, whose life would later be tragically cut short by a fanatic's dagger, was able to put an end to this social madness. But before coming to power, Henry faced a monumental problem. As a Protestant, he found himself before the closed gates of radical Catholic Paris. Realizing that continuing the war would destroy the country, he philosophically uttered the famous phrase that Paris is worth a mass, and publicly converted to Catholicism. Only after this historic compromise was he able to triumphantly enter his rebellious capital. Upon becoming the rightful king, Henry IV immediately launched a large-scale project to rebuild the ruined city, wishing to erase the memory of the deadly barricades forever. The main symbol of this new, peaceful era was the stone Pont Neuf, or New Bridge, built by his order. It was a true engineering marvel of its time. Unlike the old crossings, the Pont Neuf was the first Parisian bridge without residential buildings, offering a beautiful panoramic view of the river. It instantly became a favorite spot for walks, street vendors, and street performers, remaining a major cultural landmark to this day. Paris was steadily recovering from mass starvation and endless fighting. By royal decree, spacious squares with elegant brick facades were built, such as the famous Place des Vosges. The aristocracy happily returned to the city, safely displaying their luxurious attire. The capital was rapidly regaining its status as the European trendsetter, dictating trends in clothing, manners, and high society. However, the destructive rebellious energy had not disappeared. It had simply lain dormant in the deep, damp alleys of the poor neighborhoods, patiently awaiting a new excuse to erupt. To protect themselves, the wealthy royal court adopted a strategy of physical distancing. The monarchs began systematically isolating themselves from the common people behind the high walls of new, luxurious suburban residences. This mutual distrust gradually turned into a veritable social chasm. While the elite danced carefree at balls, the working-class districts of Paris continued to wallow in filth. The city's population was growing rapidly, and the medieval infrastructure was physically unable to cope with the human tide. Ordinary artisans survived in appalling, unsanitary conditions. The city was literally suffocating from the stench of overcrowded cemeteries, where bodies were dumped into giant mass graves in the old-fashioned way.
It was precisely this monstrous contrast between the incredible wealth of the nobility and the absolute poverty of the common people that created the ideal conditions for the coming merciless political storm.
In the 17th century, Cardinal Richelieu, a brilliant and ruthless strategist who effectively ruled France as first minister, began methodically building a rigid system of absolute monarchy. He sought to concentrate all political power, taxation, and decision-making exclusively in the hands of a single monarch. Paris became the administrative brain of this gigantic machine, transforming into the control center of a vast and complex country. However, it was this city that the powerful centralized government feared most of all. The royal court was terrified of the unpredictable streets of Paris and its aggressive, perpetually discontented inhabitants. When the young Louis XIV ascended the throne, nicknamed the Sun King for his pursuit of absolute splendor and grandeur, the city once again bared its rebellious fangs. A powerful Fronde uprising erupted, and an armed mob of Parisians stormed right into the young monarch's royal bedchamber. This nightmare was forever etched in the king's memory, and he vowed never to be at the mercy of the capital's capricious mob. He made the radical decision to relocate his court entirely from dangerous Paris to a quiet, well-guarded suburban forest. Thus began the grand construction of Versailles, the most luxurious and expensive palace complex in world history. Louis XIV forced the entire nobility to leave the capital and move to him, creating a gilded cage for the aristocracy where he could personally control their every move. Paris, meanwhile, was left to its own devices, gradually transforming into an independent and dangerous economic hub. Without the monarch's oversight, the city began to live its own vibrant and freer life. Stone theatres were built here, coffee houses opened, and the bourgeoisie rapidly accumulated independent capital. The capital's cultural life was in full swing, while talented writers created new literary masterpieces. But behind this facade of prosperity lay a problem that the monarchy preferred to ignore. The gap between the resplendent Versailles and the grimy working-class Paris was becoming catastrophic. Crime was on the rise in the capital, forcing the authorities to create the world's first professional police force. The streets began to be lit by oil lamps to at least somewhat ensure the safety of citizens after dark. However, these measures could not solve the deep-seated social problems. Ordinary Parisians continued to eke out a living in unsanitary conditions, huddling in damp basements and often without enough money even for bread. In the 18th century, Paris became the main center of the European Enlightenment. Voltaire, a sharp-tongued philosopher and defender of civil liberties, along with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a thinker who championed natural human rights, and Denis Diderot, the compiler of the monumental Encyclopédie, openly discussed ideas of freedom and equality. These philosophical discussions found a devoted audience in fashionable salons and coffee houses, which became the internet of their time. A paradox emerged. The elite itself eagerly read books proving the illegitimacy of its own power, while the ideas of the Enlightenment slowly eroded the foundations of the monarchy. Meanwhile, the city faced a physical crisis due to years of overpopulation. The cemetery of the Innocents in the center of Paris was so overcrowded that bodies began to fall through the floors into the basements of neighboring houses. The stench was so unbearable that people fainted right on the streets.
the authorities were forced to make a gruesome decision: to dig up the remains of millions of people and move them to abandoned quarries.
This is how the famous Paris catacombs came to be, where the bones of more than 6 million people now rest. Beneath the City of Light, a vast city of the dead took shape. However, even this sanitation operation did not save the monarchy from its main affliction. Paris was suffocating under taxes and the indifference of the royal court, while the price of bread skyrocketed. The ideas of the philosophers clashed with the empty stomachs of the poor, and the city began to prepare for an explosion that would destroy the old world forever. In the spring of 1789, class tensions in Paris reached a critical point. Louis XVI, an indecisive and mild-mannered monarch destined to become the last king of the old order, was forced to convene the Estates General at Versailles. Instead of resolving financial problems, he faced an open revolt by the Third Estate, which declared itself the National Assembly and vowed to draft a constitution. The city erupted instantly. The Parisians realized that the king was gathering mercenary troops to suppress the protest, and on July 14th, a huge crowd marched toward the Bastille in search of gunpowder and weapons. This gloomy medieval prison had for centuries been a symbol of royal tyranny. Although on that day there were only 7 prisoners there, the storming of the Bastille marked the moment of Pum, when real power shifted from the crown to the armed mob in the streets. The commander of the fortress, who had surrendered, was beheaded, and his head was triumphantly paraded through the streets on a pike. This ritual set a bloody tone for the entire revolution, turning brutality into the main political argument. Upon learning of the fall of the Bastille, Louis XVI wrote the word "nothing" in his diary, failing to realize that his era had come to an end. Soon, a crowd of starving women marched on Versailles, demanding bread. They forced the royal family to move to Paris under guard to the Tuileries Palace. From that moment on, the streets of the capital began to dictate the laws of the entire country. The revolutionary machine demanded more and more blood. Guillotines, new devices for swift execution, appeared in the squares. Soon, on the Place de la Révolution, hundreds of people were methodically beheaded every day. In the winter of 1793, the deposed King Louis XVI himself ascended the scaffold, and Queen Marie Antoinette followed him later. Paris brutally shattered the myth of the divine origin of power, and a period of the reign of terror began in the decapitated city. It was led by Maximilien Robespierre, an incorruptible but fanatical leader who turned virtue into terror. The revolution began to devour its own children, sending yesterday's heroes to their deaths. A primal fear gripped Paris as carts carrying doomed citizens rolled daily toward the guillotine. The nightmare ended only when Robespierre himself found himself beneath the blade, for the city had grown weary of the purges. Thus, Napoleon Bonaparte, a young and ambitious artillery general with a genius for military strategy, appeared on the political scene. He understood that a wayward city could only be governed through iron discipline and great victories. The revolution had ended, leaving behind rivers of blood and the ideals of freedom, but the city was destined to become the center of a powerful empire. Paris was preparing to change its appearance once again, becoming a monumental showcase of one man's triumph. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to absolute power was a logical response to Paris's 10 years of terrible exhaustion from revolutionary chaos. Thanks to his outstanding military victories abroad, this brilliant artillery general and ambitious politician quickly became the nation's foremost idol. In the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral, he himself imperiously placed a magnificent imperial crown upon his head. It was an incredible historical paradox. The city that had only recently beheaded its rightful king in a bloody triumph now welcomed the new dictator with sincere joy. The freedom-loving Parisians agreed to trade the ideals of the Republic for a military empire because Napoleon gave them exactly what they had been waiting for so long. He brought clear laws, stable prices, and great national pride. Having become a full-fledged emperor, Napoleon decided to transform filthy Paris into the most beautiful and magnificent capital in the entire world. He began laying out new straight streets, building stone embankments, and erecting majestic monuments on a truly Roman scale. It was on his direct orders that the famous Arc de Triomphe was erected on Place de l'Étoile, a site that still captivates tourists to this day. It was intended to commemorate the military triumphs of the French army and inspire awe in everyone entering the city. The capital was rapidly changing its appearance, transforming from revolutionary ruins into a luxurious imperial showcase.
The former royal palace, the Louvre, was finally transformed into the most gorgeous public museum on the planet.
Entire truckloads of priceless works of art were brought here, which the French army had systematically seized in the conquered countries of Europe. An ordinary Parisian, proudly strolling through these vast halls filled with foreign trophies, felt like a true master of the world and a participant in his nation's great victories. Art became a powerful tool of propaganda, proving the empire's absolute cultural superiority over all other nations. Any timid attempts at political opposition or street riots were suppressed instantly and with terrifying brutality. The metropolis, which was accustomed to overthrowing authorities at the barricades, found itself tightly gripped in the steel vice of police control. However, this imposed iron order rested solely on an endless chain of military successes. As soon as fickle fortune turned its back on Napoleon in the harsh Russian snows, the empire began to collapse rapidly. In 1814, Allied troops, including the Russian and Prussian armies, advanced to the very gates of Paris. The townspeople sincerely believed that their homes would be burned to the ground, as had recently happened to Moscow. But the frightened city surrendered almost without a fight, preferring to preserve its beautiful new buildings and the lives of its people. Russian Cossacks set up their encampments right on the Champs-Élysées, becoming an exotic spectacle for the locals. The occupation proceeded relatively peacefully, but it brought about fateful political changes. Along with the foreign armies, the old Bourbon dynasty returned to the country, the monarchical family that Parisians had overthrown and brutally executed just 20 years earlier. This restoration of the monarchy seemed like a cruel mockery of all the bloodshed during the era of the Great French Revolution.
In 1830, Paris clearly demonstrated that a successful revolution had become an ingrained political habit.
On the throne at that time was Charles X, a staunch conservative and ardent advocate of the restoration of absolute royal power. When this self-assured monarch attempted to severely restrict press freedom, the city was immediately covered in barricades. In just 3 glorious days of bloody street fighting, the king was overthrown and fled the country in disgrace. The narrow streets of the capital once again defeated the crown, demonstrating that ideas always prove stronger than armed soldiers. The new government became slightly more liberal, but the problem of extreme poverty and social inequality did not disappear. By the mid-19th century, the massive Industrial Revolution began to radically transform the capital's economy and demographics. Impoverished peasants flocked to the city in search of work, creating vast, destitute working-class suburbs. These people toiled for 14 hours a day under appalling conditions and lived in unbearable overcrowding. The concentration of brutally exploited workers in the very heart of the country could not end peacefully. This constant pressure led to Paris once again erupting in 1848 with a new, even more violent social revolution, in which the proletariat desperately demanded real civil rights. The Napoleonic era and the turbulent decades that followed cemented the city's status as the world capital of permanent revolt.
Paris demonstrated that it could be both a submissive imperial showcase and a battlefield for the rights of the poor.
Political power shifted with kaleidoscopic speed, but no ruler could fully tame this fiery metropolis. To permanently deprive the rebellious townspeople of the physical ability to build barricades, A completely new and ruthless approach was required. The next leader would find this ingenious solution, cold-bloodedly destroying half of the old capital for the sake of its own illusory salvation. In 1852, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great commander, came to absolute power in France. This cunning politician paved his way to the throne through populism and ambitiously proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon III. He looked at his capital and saw only a dirty, overcrowded city with a tangled network of narrow medieval streets. The emperor understood perfectly well that these winding streets were the ideal setting for popular uprisings, where a small group of people could hold off a regular army for days on end. To solve this problem once and for all, he hired Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann, a pragmatic and efficient bureaucrat who was not afraid to make the most unpopular decisions. Napoleon III gave his prefect an unprecedented assignment to completely redraw the map of the capital, with no regard for historical values or the enormous costs involved. Baron Haussmann approached the task with the cold calculation of an engineer and the ruthlessness of an experienced military surgeon. He literally cut through the dense old urban fabric to create gigantic, wide, and perfectly straight boulevards.
For the sake of this ambitious project, entire neighborhoods with centuries of history were cold-bloodedly demolished.
Tens of thousands of poor working-class families were forcibly evicted to the outskirts of the city without any adequate financial compensation. Thus, on the bones of the old world, the very dazzling, spacious, and geometrically perfect Paris that we know today was born. However, the hidden goal of these grandiose architectural transformations was not at all a concern for aesthetics or the health of the city's residents. The wide boulevards were built precisely so that government cavalry and heavy artillery could move quickly along them. In parallel with the destruction of the old city, Baron Haussmann created a modern infrastructure for the new industrial era. A gigantic sewer system was laid underground, which permanently rid the metropolis of its perpetual stench. Luxurious green parks were laid out, new train stations were built, and long rows of buildings with identical, elegant facades were erected. The city was rapidly transforming into the most advanced capital in all of Western Europe. But this comfort came at the price of a harsh class divide and the final displacement of the poor into dreary factory suburbs. This new, bourgeois Paris became a hub of incredible wealth, expensive entertainment, and unrestrained consumption. The first massive department stores appeared in the city centre, where wealthy residents could spend hours strolling among luxurious fabrics and new fragrances. The bright boulevards filled with trendy cafes, theatres, and restaurants where the new elite enjoyed life. But while the bourgeoisie sipped champagne, social tensions between the well-fed centre and the starving outskirts continued to grow by the day, setting the capital on a course toward a new, inevitable catastrophe. In 1870, Napoleon III's empire arrogantly plunged into a senseless war with a rising Prussia. The French army was shamefully routed, and the emperor himself quickly and humiliatingly surrendered to German forces. After that, the enemy army advanced right up to the walls of Paris and placed the city under the most brutal siege of a long blockade. During that harsh wartime winter, the residents of Europe's most dazzling capital were driven to utter despair. Despite the terrible hardships and daily artillery bombardments, the citizens fiercely demanded that the defense continue and that they not surrender to the occupiers. However, the official government decided to sign a humiliating peace treaty, which sparked an incredible outburst of rage. In the spring of 1871, armed workers and the National Guard launched a powerful uprising against their own weak leadership. They boldly proclaimed the Paris Commune, which became the first unique experiment in history to create a genuine workers' state. Once again, the city broke away from the rest of the country, openly defying not only external enemies, but also its own politicians. Inspired by the Commune, the Communards sincerely attempted to build an ideal utopian society of universal equality. They radically abolished rent arrears and placed abandoned factories under the control of workers' collectives. In a burst of political rage, they even toppled the massive Vendôme column, which served as the chief symbol of the imperial militarism of a bygone era. But this social experiment was doomed to an incredibly brutal destruction. In May of that same year, government troops, tacitly supported by German forces, began a systematic assault on the rebellious city. Baron Haussmann's wide, beautiful boulevards finally fulfilled their true bloody purpose, allowing the army to advance unimpeded and swiftly. This terrible battle went down in history as the Bloody Week and became the most horrific internal conflict in the entire history of Paris. Soldiers mercilessly shot the defenders of the Commune right on the barricades, while workers retreating in utter despair began setting historic buildings ablaze en masse. The famous Tuileries Palace burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. In this monstrous street massacre, about 20,000 ordinary citizens, including women and children, were killed. Once again, the city waged a brutal war against itself, leaving behind only mountains of corpses, burning ashes, and eternal class hatred.
The brutal defeat of the Paris Congress became a profound psychological trauma for the entire society.
For many decades to come, the authorities clearly demonstrated that they were prepared to physically annihilate a vast portion of their citizens solely to preserve the political order.
The city was terribly bled dry, destroyed, and plunged into deep mourning.
For its residents who had been killed or sent to penal servitude, it seemed that after such a catastrophe, the capital would never recover. But the history of Paris is full of paradoxes. Just a few decades later, right on these charred ruins, the most brilliant and carefree cultural era in all of European history would emerge. After all the horrors of the Bloody Week and the bloodshed of the Commune, Paris decided to radically change its internal mindset. The city seemed to be desperately trying to erase the terrible memories, plunging headlong into an era of incredible art and unrestrained revelry. This vibrant historical period came to be known as the Belle Époque. The epicenter of this new, scandalous bohemian life was Montmartre Hill. Once a quiet outskirt dotted with windmills, it was now where poor artists, poets, and dancers were creating a culture of creative freedom. It was in Montmartre in 1889 that the famous Moulin Rouge Cabaret opened, becoming the main symbol of Paris's carefree nightlife. Here, girls danced the daring cancan, and wealthy aristocrats sat at the same tables as destitute but brilliant artists. The city became a powerful magnet for the Impressionists. Masters such as Claude Monet and Pierre-Auguste Renoir captured the light on the new boulevards and created paintings that defied classical canons. Official conservative critics initially hated this bold style of painting, but it was precisely this rebellious, incomprehensible art that forever established Paris as the world's leading capital of painting. In that same year, 1889, the city was preparing to host a grand World's Fair to showcase its definitive rebirth to the world. It was decided to build a gigantic iron structure over 300 meters tall as the main entrance arch. When engineer Gustave Eiffel's project began to take shape, the refined Parisians were horrified. Writers and artists drafted angry petitions, calling the tower an ugly iron monster that hopelessly spoiled the capital's classical appearance. They demanded that the structure be dismantled immediately after the exhibition ended, completely failing to realize that they were looking at the future symbol of France. The city was rapidly modernizing. In 1900, the first line of the Paris metro opened. Modern trains began running underground, connecting different neighborhoods and dramatically accelerating the pace of life. Electric streetlights transformed Paris at night into a true city of light. It seemed that the dark era of barricades and bloodshed had been consigned to the past forever, giving way to technological progress and beauty. Paris very successfully sold the image of an ideal city to the whole world, a place where there was no room for pain, poverty, or political crises. Millions of foreign tourists came here to sit in a cafe in Montparnasse and feel like part of this fairy tale. But beneath the luxurious golden facade, the old social tensions hadn't gone anywhere. They had simply quieted down for the time being. Workers in factories in the dirty suburbs continued to toil for pennies and organized powerful political unions. This glittering and carefree illusion would be shattered by an event that would force the city to remember war and mass death once again. In August 1914, World War I broke out in Europe, and the celebration ended instantly. The German army rapidly broke through the front lines and began advancing directly on the French capital. By early September, the enemy was just 50 kilometers from Paris, and the government fled in panic to the city of Bordeaux. The situation was saved by the famous French ingenuity and a completely unexpected, purely civilian mode of transport. The military governor ordered all available Parisian taxis to be requisitioned to urgently transport soldiers to the front lines. The convoy of hundreds of civilian cars heading to the front looked surreal, but these famous Marne taxis helped deliver reinforcements in time. The powerful German offensive was successfully halted, and the city miraculously survived. But the brutal war dragged on for 4 long years, turning Paris into a massive rear area hospital where thousands of maimed soldiers were brought every day. After the victory in 1918, the city tried to quickly return to its carefree life. The Roaring Twenties arrived, and Paris became the main refuge for the lost generation from all over the world. Writers Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, as well as artist Pablo Picasso, gathered in bars and created new, great art. The city pulsed to the rhythms of American jazz, while Coco Chanel was revolutionizing women's fashion. Once again, Paris managed to transform the horrific trauma of war into a powerful cultural explosion. But this proud metropolis never knew how to fully rid itself of its internal contradictions. In the spring of 1940, the formidable German war machine swept across France with incredible speed. The French army, considered one of the strongest in Europe, was shamefully defeated in just a few tragic weeks. On June 14th, German tanks rolled unopposed into the empty streets of Paris, which had surrendered without a single shot being fired. The French government decided not to defend the capital and officially declared Paris an open city to save its unique architecture from total destruction by bombing. This difficult decision did indeed save the monuments, but it inflicted a deep moral wound on all the residents of the once proud metropolis. With tears in their eyes, Parisians watched in horror as the Nazi swastika rose above the Eiffel Tower. This disgrace was confirmed by photographs in which Adolf Hitler posed against the backdrop of a completely subjugated Paris. The City of Light was instantly plunged into darkness. A strict curfew was imposed, and scarce food rations were distributed exclusively by ration cards. The darkest period in history began when the city had to learn to survive under enemy rule. The occupation divided the residents of Paris into 3 unequal and very complex categories, forever altering their fates. Some consciously chose the path of collaboration, actively cooperating with the Nazis for money, career advancement, or simply out of fear. Others secretly joined the underground resistance movement, risking their lives daily to distribute leaflets and carry out acts of sabotage. But the vast majority of ordinary citizens during those 4 terrible years simply tried to survive unnoticed. They looked away and desperately tried not to notice the horrors unfolding on neighboring streets. And the horrors were indeed taking place right in the heart of Europe's most civilized city. In 1942, the French police, acting on direct orders from the Nazis, carried out a mass roundup of Jews known as the Veil d'Hiv roundup. About 13,000 people, including women and small children, were herded into the winter velodrome under appalling conditions. Most of these betrayed people were sent to death camps and never returned to Paris. It was a tremendous national disgrace that the city desperately tried to forget for many decades after the war ended. But while some were betraying, others were waging a desperate guerrilla war in the shadows of Parisian back alleys and metro stations. Resistance fighters coolly killed German officers, blew up military trains, and passed intelligence to Allied forces. The Nazis responded to every such killing with savage brutality. They took dozens of random Parisians hostage and executed them in retaliation, methodically drenching the city in blood. By August 1944, Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy and began advancing rapidly toward the capital. Upon learning of this, the Paris police and workers launched an open-armed uprising against the German garrison. Once again, as in the old revolutionary days, barricades made of felled trees and overturned cars sprang up in the streets. At that moment, Adolf Hitler issued a mad order to General Dietrich von Holtz, the commander of Paris, to mine all bridges and monuments in order to wipe the city off the face of the earth before the inevitable retreat. Is Paris burning? Hitler constantly asked his generals this frantic question, but von Holtz did the unimaginable. He refused to carry out this order and did not blow up the ancient capital. The German general proved prudent enough to spare world history, and this miracle saved the city. On August 25th, French and American troops entered a jubilant but utterly demoralized Paris. General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, symbolizing the long-awaited return of France's national pride. Paris survived physically, but emerged from this war with a severe moral hangover and deep psychological scars. After the liberation, spontaneous lynchings began in the streets against those suspected of collaborating with the occupiers. Women seen associating with German soldiers had their heads publicly shaved, subjecting them to humiliation. World War II clearly demonstrated that Paris could be physically broken, but its spirit would always find a way out. The city processed the severe trauma of the occupation, transforming it into new philosophical concepts, such as Sartre's existentialism and a completely new art. It began to modernize rapidly, trying to catch up with the times and regain its status as the world's capital. But has the hidden, rebellious nature of Parisians, which for centuries drove them to build street barricades, changed? The coming era will prove that even a well-fed modern Paris is always ready to blow itself up from within. The main formula for Paris's development has remained unchanged for centuries. Any deep crisis here inevitably leads to restructuring and a new historical triumph. The ideas of freedom, equality, and human rights, born in these dirty back alleys and bustling cafes, ultimately completely transformed the laws of the entire modern civilized world.